In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to add a backend to a React project that uses Docker. So in this tutorial, we're going to be adding a backend REST API to an existing React project. And we're going to use the following technologies for that. We're going to use Django REST Framework for the backend API. And as you may know if you follow the channel, I'm a big fan of Django REST Framework. I use it for lots of different projects, and I have a couple of courses on it which you can find links to in the description of this video if you're interested in going in depth into Django REST Framework and learning a lot about it. I'm also a big fan of Docker, which is included in those courses as well. So we're going to be using that in this tutorial too, and we're also going to be using React. So the prerequisites before you continue are that you need to have Docker and Docker Compose installed on your machine. So there are two main ways you can do that. You can either use Docker Desktop. This is the easiest way. If you're just using it as an individual, then you don't need to worry about any of the licensing issues, and that's the easiest way to get it installed. Or you can use Kulima like I'll be using, which is a tool that you can download. It's free and open source and allows you to use Docker on your machine if you're using Mac or Linux. I'll put the links to both those technologies in the description of the video in case you need to go and install them first. You're also going to need the starting code. So we have a previous tutorial where we create a React project and set it up using Docker. We're going to be starting off where that tutorial left off. So if you follow that tutorial, great, you can just download the code from the point that we finished that tutorial. Or if you want to go and do that first, then you can. It's entirely optional. If you prefer and you just want to learn the backend stuff, then you can just start straight with the example code that we provide in the link. So we'll provide links in the descriptions to all of these resources. You're also, of course, going to need a code editor. I'll be using Visual Studio Code. You can, of course, use whichever editor you prefer. Okay, so we're going to break this tutorial down into the following sections. We're going to have some basic housekeeping where we just make some small changes to the existing project. Then we're going to set up Docker for the backend. So we're going to add a Docker file that allows us to run Django REST Framework. And we're going to configure Docker Compose so that we can run our services on our machine and have a local development environment. And we're going to be creating a very, very basic backend REST API, which we can use to test our integration with React. And then we're going to connect this API to our React project. So I'm going to show you how to set all of this up using Docker, Docker Compose, and what I consider to be best practices, reusable code, easily producible environments, and so on. Okay, so let's jump in. Before we continue, I should mention that we have an accompanying blog post to this tutorial on our website, londonappdeveloper.com. You can also find the link to that in the description of the video. So if you want to go there, it's really useful to be able to copy and paste the code at some points when we're typing some really tedious things, or you want to see a text-based explanation for that, then feel free to go and check that out on our website. So we're going to start by cloning the starting point project that we're going to use, which is this Dockerized React project, which was the end of the how to Dockerize React video. So go ahead and click on that link in the resources, and you're going to copy the HTTPS clone URL. And then I'm going to open up my terminal, or if you're using Windows, you'll use your command prompt. I'm going to change to the location where I keep my projects, and I'm going to git clone and pull down that source code. Okay, so now I'm going to change into that by typing cd Dockerize React, and I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code by typing code and dot. And here we have the starting point project. So we're going to build on this code which is already there. And essentially what it contains is a Docker file and Docker Compose configuration that you can use for starting a very basic React project. So let's just go ahead and test that this runs before we continue and make changes to this project. So if you open up your terminal or your PowerShell window, you can type Docker Compose up --watch --build, hit enter, and this is going to build the Docker file and start our React app that we're going to be adding the backend to on our machine. Okay, so you can see it's running here, and we're going to go ahead and open up the browser again and just go to localhost 5173. And you should see the Vite and React project here. So if you're interested about how we set this up and all of the steps for creating this Dockerized React project, then please check out our other tutorial on Dockerizing React. As mentioned, the first thing we're going to be doing is making some minor housekeeping changes to this project. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a git ignore file, which is going to allow us to exclude certain files from Git. If you're not going to be committing this to Git, then you don't really need to do this, but I'm going to do it because I might commit this to Git and push it up to GitHub. So we're going to right click and create a new file, and the file we're going to create is called .gitignore. And I have an example of this in the project, which is linked in the description. Basically, it's a combination of two standard templates. So if you just search through your favorite search engine, GitHub gitignore Python, it will take you to this gitignore/Python example. So it's essentially this. We're just going to copy this. And then underneath it, we're going to add the node one, because these are the two main technologies which we're using. So you can actually find it here, node.gitignore. Again, this would all be linked in the description. So we're going to copy the contents of that too by clicking this copy icon here, and then I'm going to paste that to the bottom. So now we have all of the standard files for a Python project and a Node project ignored in our Git config. So we'll save that. And then what we're going to do is we are just going to make a small change where we rename this Docker file. So this Docker file is the one for our front end, which you can see is based on Node. I like to make the backend Docker file the default for the project, just because that kind of underpins the whole project. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename Dockerfile to dockerfile.frontend. And then what I'm going to do is also change that in the Docker compose here. So you can see that we have the build context here. I'm going to add a new line to point to this new updated Dockerfile name, because by default, when you just set the context to the current directory, which is what this period symbol here does, it will look for the Dockerfile called just Dockerfile. Since we rename this, we need to explicitly specify the Dockerfile that should be used for this service. So I'm going to type Dockerfile:/Dockerfile.frontend. Okay, now if we just go ahead and stop this server and just type docker compose build, you should see that this finishes successfully, and it should be super fast because everything should be cached on your machine. Okay, so that's everything for the housekeeping changes. Next, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a new Docker file to the project that we can use for our backend. So to do that, I'm going to head back to the project, and I might as well just commit this to GitHub here, git add git commit with an AM, and we're going to just say housekeeping. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add a new Docker file. So we'll right click, new file, and this is going to be called Dockerfile. And we're going to start from Python :3.13.0 -Alpine 3.20. So what we'll do is we'll type this file out, and then I will explain everything line by line. If you did want to just copy and paste this, then as I said, we have a blog post. You can just go there and you can find the link to get the example source code that you can just paste in. Okay, so we've added the from statement here. Then we're going to do env Python unbuffered 1, and then copy .requirements.txt /requirements.txt. Then copy ./backend to /backend, and then workdir /backend. Then we're going to type run Python -m venv env /py $\ampersand\, and then indented here under this run block, I'm going to type /py/bin/pip install --upgrade pip, and then $\ampersand\, again /py/bin/pip install -r /requirements.txt. Then underneath the run block, I'm going to type env path equals, and then double quote. It's very important that this is a double quote and that you do all of the quotes and all of this syntax exactly as I do it here. /py/bin, and then colon, then the $path. Then we're going to type cmd And in the square brackets here, we're going to type Python, close the quotes, new quotes on a new item, manage.py, and then same again, new quotes, run server, comma, 0.0.0.0:8000. Okay, then we'll just add one other file, then I'll explain everything. So we'll add a new file in the root of the project called requirements.txt. And in that file, we'll type Django --5.1.3 and then save the file. Okay, so let's talk through this Docker file here. So essentially what we're doing is we're starting from the Python 3.13.0 version. So I like to pin the specific versions, and I recommend that you also use these exact versions, because that means that when you're following this tutorial, you're going to be seeing exactly what I'm seeing on the screen, because we're all using the same version of everything. If you follow this video a while after it was created and you want to upgrade, then I suggest you follow the tutorial and then at the end, try and upgrade and see if it works. In most cases it will. In other cases, you might need to make some small tweaks to the project in order to upgrade to newer versions. In this case, Python 3.13 is the latest version of Python that's available. So we're starting our Docker image, which is what this Docker file does. It creates a Docker image by the steps that we add here. We're starting our Docker image from the Python 3.13.0 Alpine 3.20 image. So Python 3.13 is the version of Python. Alpine is the type of operating system that Python will run on. So Alpine OS or Alpine Linux, I think it's called, is a version of Linux that's extremely lightweight, and it's great for using with Docker because it contains absolutely the bare minimum that you need for running the Docker container, and I find it really efficient. So that's the one I use. The version here, 3.20, is the version of Alpine that we're going to use. And again, I recommend you pin everything exactly as I've done here, just so that you can make sure the steps are the same. Then we have this env Python unbuffered, and this basically makes sure that the output from Python is not buffered, which is recommended when you are working with Docker and Python. So there's actually a very in-depth, detailed explanation of what this does if you're interested in all the technical ins and outs on Stack Overflow, which we also link to from our website. Then we have the copy command here. So this copies the requirements.txt from our local machine to /requirements.txt on the Docker image. And this is going to be used to have a list of requirements that we install in our Python virtual environment that we're going to be creating in a bit. As you might remember, we just created this requirements.txt file, which we specified Django with the version 5.1.3, which again, I recommend you pin to this specific version for the purposes of this tutorial. Okay, so let's go back to our Docker file. The next line that we're going to look at is line 6, where we copy the backend directory to /backend. So this is going to copy a directory that we're going to create in our project called backend to the /backend location in the image. And this is going to contain our backend code. So this is essentially going to contain the Django project that we're going to create in a bit. Then we select the workdir or the working directory as /backend. This essentially means that the default working directory of containers that run from this image will run from the backend location. So when you run a command, it runs from /backend. It's essentially the same as typing cd /backend every time you run something. Then you have this run block here. So from line 9 to 11, we have run. We start with run python -m venv env /py. This creates a virtual environment inside our Docker image. And some people say that you don't need to create virtual environments when you're working with Docker. I tend to disagree because in some cases, although it can be rare, it can be the case that the Docker image that you're using may have its own Python dependencies installed and you don't want anything to conflict. So I just find it a lot cleaner when you specify a separate virtual environment inside your Docker container or inside your Docker image when you're working with Python on Docker. So this creates a new virtual environment called env in the /py location. Then we have the /py/bin/pip install, and this line on line 10 actually upgrades pip. And the reason why we specify the full path of pip is because we want to upgrade it in the virtual environment that we just created. If you just specify pip install upgrade pip without the /py/bin, then what will happen is it will just upgrade pip for the version that's installed outside of this virtual environment. However, because we're going to be using this virtual environment for all of our code or running our code, then we want to specify the specific virtual environment that we're going to install or upgrade pip on. Same for line 11, we do /py/bin/pip install -r requirements, and this will install all the requirements defined in our requirements.txt file. You may ask, well, why did we not just do separate run commands, separate run statements for each of these lines that we have from line 9 to 11? The reason for this is because it's best practice when you work with Docker to minimize the number of layers that your Docker file creates. So every single one of these lines that starts with a statement like from, env, copy, workdir, and so on, they all create a new layer that forms our Docker image. And then Docker will use caching to cache previous layers that are not changed to make sure that it's really efficient when you're rebuilding your Docker image. So what would happen here is if we were to put run on 3 separate lines. So on line 9, 10, and 11, we had run at the beginning. Then what would happen in that case is it would create 3 layers instead of 1, which is just slightly less efficient for the caching. So it's best to group all of your commands onto one line where possible. And that's what we're doing here with the && backslash that we have here. We're joining up a single command onto multiple lines. So it appears like it's on multiple lines, but really it's only one single run statement. Then we have the env statement here. So this specifies the path. The reason we do this is because we want to be able to run access packages and run commands from our virtual environment without having to specify this /py/bin every single time we want to run something in our virtual environment. So the way we do that is we add env path, we add the /py/bin directory location to our system path, which essentially means every time you run a command, it checks to see if there's a command that matches the command you specified inside that location. We have the $path at the end here so that we keep the existing path in place. On all Linux machines, it has a path variable that's used. Basically, we don't want to overwrite all the existing path entries that might be needed for the operating system. We just want to append, or I should say prepend in this case, because we're adding it to the beginning, the /py/bin location. Then we have the command here. So this is the default command that will run when you create containers from this image. It can be overridden, as you'll see inside our Docker Compose config, which we'll do in a bit. But essentially, this is the default. When you deploy this to production, you may change this default to the command that starts the Unicorn server, which will run this in production. For now, we're just using it for development. So we're just going to use the Django development server here. Okay, so we can go ahead and test this works. The first thing we need to do though, before we can test, is we need to create a backend directory in our project. Otherwise it will fail on this line because that doesn't exist. So we're just going to create an empty directory here called backend. And then we can open up the terminal and type docker build and then the dot symbol. This should go ahead and build our Docker file. You can see I used a legacy version of the build, but we're not going to be using that for the rest of the video. We're going to be building things using Docker Compose, so that doesn't matter too much. Okay, so once the Docker file is built successfully, we can move on to the next step. First, I'm just going to commit this to git add dot git commit -m added Docker file config. Okay, so next we're going to move on to setting up Docker Compose on this project. So you can see we already have a Docker Compose config here, which we actually use for our Docker Compose setup for our front end. We're going to be adding a new service here for our back end. So let's add a new line to the bottom, and we're going to add a new block that is level with this indentation here of the services. So this is where we define our services. We're going to type backend : which is the name of the service, and then build : context : period symbol, and then ports : and then -8000 : 8000, Then we're going to type volumes : hyphen dot / backend, then : / backend. Okay, so this adds a new service to our Docker Compose configuration. The service is going to be called Backend, as you can see on line 16. And then we have this build block here. And the build block essentially defines where the context is, or where we want to build the image for the container that we're going to run on this service. So we're going to specify the current context of the current directory that the Docker Compose config is running from. And essentially what that will do is it will automatically pick up the default Docker file in the project, and it will use that to build the image that it will use to run this service. Then we specify the ports. So our Django development server is going to run on port 8000. So we map port 8000 in the container to port 8000 in the local machine. So that will allow us to access our service on port 8000. Then we have a volume here. So we're going to use volumes / backend, which is the backend directory in our project. And we're going to map that to the / backend location on the running container. The reason we do that is so that we can have live reloading and our changes are automatically reflected in the development server that is running inside Docker. So Docker works in a completely isolated file system. It has its own file system. If you want changes in your project to end up in your running Docker container or your Docker server, then you need to map a volume. If you did take the React tutorial that we used to create the starting project for this, then you might have remembered that we talk about this develop watch. That is specifically for Node projects, although you can use it on Python projects. I haven't found that it's necessary. I prefer it's more simpler just to use the volumes line here. The only reason I used the watch functionality for the React project is because Node has some problems picking up changes from a mapped volume. It doesn't automatically restart the server and so on. So I prefer to use the watch functionality. If you're interested in learning more about that, then we go into it in depth in our Dockerized React tutorial. So next, what we're going to do is we are going to test this. So essentially what we need to do is run from our project Docker compose build, and this will just test that it's picking up the correct images that it's building. So you can see here it's building our Python image again from our default Docker file to create the image needed to run the backend service. Once that's run, we can go ahead and actually create our Django project. So if you follow any of my other stuff, you know that I like to do everything through Docker because it makes it simpler. So instead of running things directly on our machine and having to install Python, I'm going to create the Django project using the Docker Compose config that we've created. And I'm going to do that by typing docker compose run --rm backend sh-c and then Django-admin start project backend, then the period symbol, and then close the quotes. So I'll just explain what this does before we continue because there's quite a lot there. So essentially we call the docker compose run command, which is used to run a specific service that is defined in our Docker Compose configuration. Then we specify this RM, which says after you run this and create the container, remove the container from the system. And the reason we do this is because this is only a one-time container that we want to create just for the purposes of starting our Django project. So in order to prevent these containers from building up on the system and just sitting there, I specify the RM flag here, which allows us to automatically clear it after. You could omit that and then just periodically run docker system prune, which will remove those containers that are not in use, but I like to do it as we go just to prevent things from building up. Then we specify the name of the service, which is backend. So after the RM flag, we have backend, and that's the name of the service in our Docker Compose config that we want to run. So you can actually see it on the screen behind the terminal on line 16. We have the backend, so that matches the name that we add here. Then we have sh-c. This is kind of optional, but I like to pass this in because this is the command that's being passed into the service that we're running. So you could just start writing the command directly, but I find it's hard to distinguish what forms part of the Docker Compose syntax and what forms part of the command we're passing to the container. So I like to separate it by doing sh-c, which just says run the shell command inside the quotes that we provide here. So you can see we've got sh-c and then we start the quotation. And inside those quotations, we have Django admin start project backend, then the period symbol. So that says run the Django admin command, which is accessible because we installed it using pip inside our Docker file. Then we have start project, which is the Django command for starting a fresh project. We want to call the project backend. That's just the name I'm giving the project. You might have a different name, but I recommend for this tutorial, stick with the names I'm providing here. So then we have the period symbol, which says we want to create this project called backend in the current directory. If you don't specify that, then it's going to create another subdirectory called backend, but we're going to tell it to just create the backend project in the current directory that we're in. And because in our Docker file, we specified the work dir as backend, that will be the current directory that we're running the command from. So that way we know that the project is going to get added to the backend directory inside our container, and then our Docker compose volume mapping is going to map that back to the backend directory here. So we should see the files appear in our project in backend. So let's go ahead and hit enter here. We'll see if I type that all correctly. It looks like it worked. So it doesn't have any output here, but you should see that it adds these additional files which form the standard Django project that we're going to use to create our backend. So now we have a basic Django project added to our project. So I'm just going to commit this, git commit -am. Actually, we need to type git add dot to add the new files, git commit -am, and then I'm just going to say added Docker compose config and Django project. Okay, brilliant. So now that we've done that, we can move on to the next step, which is to actually create a very basic API in our project. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're just going to add a couple more dependencies to our requirements.txt, and these are going to be Django REST Framework equals 3.15.2 and Django CORS headers equals 4.6.0. So the Django REST Framework is the framework we're going to use that sits on top of Django that will allow us to easily create REST APIs that we can use for our project. Again, if you're interested in learning in-depth Django REST Framework, then we have courses for that which are listed on our website. Then we have the Django's CORS headers, which you can see here, and essentially that is a library that we need to install for allowing CORS access, CORS, and CORS means cross-origin resource sharing, which essentially means that we can only make requests to our API or to our project from a site that's running on the same domain. It's a security functionality. We need to override that and allow us to make requests from a different domain because our app is going to be running on a different host. It's going to be running on a separate port number. So we need to add this library, and I'm going to show you how to configure that in a minute. Okay, so we're going to save the requirements.txt file, and then we're going to open up our settings.py. So that is inside backend/settings.py. And we're going to scroll down here and we're going to find the installed apps. We need to install our new Django REST Framework app that we've added and also our CORS headers. So we'll start with CORS headers by typing CORS headers and then close the quote and then comma, and then a new line we're going to add REST Framework. So this enables these libraries in our Django project. It adds them to the Django installed apps. There's one other thing that we need to do for the CORS headers, which is add it above this middleware here. So you're going to find the django.middleware.common middleware, add a new line above that, and that line is going to say CORS headers.middleware.C CORS middleware. And that's it for that line. So essentially what this does is it adds a new middleware for our CORS headers. I'm just going to make sure that I type that correctly. I think I missed the where here. So middleware, there we go. That's correct. Okay, so CORS headers.middleware.CORS middleware. This adds a middleware that allows the CORS library or the CORS headers library to essentially be able to inject different things into the headers, which allows it to accept requests from different domain names. Where do we define those domain names? We're going to define them inside the settings.py file at the bottom of this file here. So scroll to the bottom and add CORS_allowed_origins equals, And then in the quotes here, we're going to add a new item called http://localhost:5173. And that is the host that our front-end API is going to be running on. Okay, so once that's done, we can move on to the next step, which is actually creating a very basic API that we can use to test. So normally what I would do is go through the whole process of creating separate apps and setting them all up and mapping the URLs all nicely, and also adding the database and the backend and the database and the Django admin and so on. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to show you how to connect a Django project to React. So we're going to skip all of that, and we're just going to add a new file in this existing backend directory called views.py. Inside views, we're going to create a new view here essentially. So I'm going to start by doing from datetime import datetime from rest_framework.decorators import API view, and from REST framework.response import response. So you might be wondering why we're getting these underlines here, and that's because the VS Code editor that we're using is unable to access the file system inside our Docker container, which contains our requirements. That includes these libraries that we're importing from here, such as REST framework. So there's a few ways around that. You can go ahead and configure VS Code to integrate with Docker. However, I find that quite a time-consuming and tedious process, and I've never really got it to work very well. If you have different ways of doing it, then I encourage you to put them in the comments below and maybe get a discussion going on that. What I'd like to do, just because it's the easiest option, is I just create a virtual environment directly in my project here, which is a little bit off course from how I like to do Docker and isolate everything inside Docker containers. But just for the purposes of this video, I'm going to do this as it's the easy route to get a nice looking code editor that has autocomplete. So I'm going to type Python -m venv. It's going to create a new virtual environment in our project. Then I'll do source env/bin/activate, and then pip install -r, and then requirements.txt. This will install our requirements here. And then if I go back to VS Code, you can see that it's already noticed that we have a new virtual environment, and we can hit yes to make it work on that. And then these go away, and also it gives you the autocomplete functionality here for the library. So we'll put that back, and then we'll continue. So next, what we're going to do is create a simple view that just renders a very basic response that we can use for testing. So I'm going to type def hello_world. That's what we'll call our view. And as with all Django views, you need to have the request argument here as the first argument on the function. And then we're going to add just some text here that says hello world endpoint. And for this endpoint, we're going to just do return response. And in the response, we're going to add message as the key, and then colon, and then we're going to use the formatted string literal here to put hello world colon, and we're just going to add inside the braces here datetime.now.iso format. And the reason why we're going to do this is just because I want it to show that it is, this should be now, not. I want it to show that this API essentially works. So I want to be able to click this API or click a button inside our React project that calls this API, and we can see the response change every time. So I'm just going to put the datetime.now ISO format, which will return the current date and time. So we should see that the API is working. We're going to be adding this as an API function view. So we're going to use the API_view decorator. And then inside the arguments here, we're going to add a list here, and we're going to add get. So that means this API is going to accept a HTTP GET request, and that is going to return the response. So this API view comes from Django REST Framework. It allows you to make a very simple API using functional views instead of using the classes that usually you would use with Django REST Framework. It's just a very simple way of creating a basic API on a few lines of code that allow you to return a response here. So we're wrapping the response in the response object here, which Django REST Framework provides. That will make sure that the response is formatted as JSON, and also allows us to use the browsable API and so on. Okay, so next what we need to do is connect this view up to a URL. So if you open up urls.py inside the backend directory, we're going to add a line below this path line here. So on line 20, I'm adding it from backend.views import hello_world. So we're importing this view function that we just created, and then we're going to connect this up to a URL by adding a new path to the top of the URL patterns here. So we're going to type path, and the path is going to be /API/hello-world/, and then we're going to pass in the hello world view here at the end, and make sure you add a comma here and then save the file. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just test that this API works. So open up your terminal or your PowerShell and type docker compose up --watch --build. Of course, if you already have the service running, then you're going to want to stop that and then run it again. So this is going to rebuild our image because we made a change to requirements.txt, which basically told the Docker file to rebuild here because one of the layers changed. So it will rebuild every layer after the one that's changed. In this case, the one that changed is our requirements.txt here. So, or actually it was this one that changed because that's where it copies the requirements.txt. It detected a change, so it rebuilds the whole Docker file. Okay, so you can see that the command is working here. I did get some warnings, but we won't worry about that for now because we will worry about it. We'll go back in here and remove this leading / which shouldn't be there. So we'll save that again. That should automatically reload our server and then that warning goes away. Okay, so now that the server's running, open up your browser again and we're just going to go to localhost /8000, which is running our Django project. And because we don't have anything mapped to the root of the app, it's going to give us this not found. So we're going to just type /API/hello-world/, hit enter, and you can see that in this nice Django REST framework formatted response, we have the message here. So if you refresh this, you can see that the little time stamp here is changing every time because we're refreshing and getting the latest response back from the API. Okay, so I'm just going to commit this to our project again. So do git add git commit -am added basic REST API. And now we can move on to the next and final section, which is configuring our React project to use this API. Okay, so let's go ahead and head back to the project and then open up our React code, which is in front end. And we're going to look for src and then app.jsx. So if we just flip over to the browser again, and because we have our things running, our Docker image running here, you can see that React is still running and it has this default page, which is the template that's created automatically by Vite when you create a React project, React plus Vite, and then the count increases here. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this. So instead of the count increasing, it's going to call our REST API and just put the response here, just so we can prove our front end is calling our backend API. So head back to the project, open up frontend /src/app.jsx. And what we're going to do is we are going to add, or we're going to change this here. So instead of count, we're going to say response, which will be for our API response. Instead of set count, we're going to do set response. And then the use state, we're going to change the default value that's given here to just the quotations here. That sets the default state of response to an empty string. Now, the ins and outs of React is a little bit out of scope here. I just want to show you how to connect to React. If you're interested in us creating more content on how to actually learn React, then please let us know in the comments and we'll go ahead and create more tutorials for that if there's enough interest. So now that we have this state updated here, we're going to add a function that allows us to call our API. So we're going to type const, and I'm going to call this update response equals async, and then the open close quotes, and then the little arrow symbol here, and then a new arrow function or an anonymous function as it's called. We'll do const res equals await fetch, and then we're going to fetch from the URL http://localhost:8000/API/hello-world/ end with a semicolon here, and then we'll do const data equals await res.json, and we'll call that function there. And again, end with the semicolon, and then set response, going to do data and then message. Okay, so we'll just talk over what this function does. So it's a standard JavaScript anonymous function. We call async because we want to make it an asynchronous function, which means it calls other functions that we need to wait for the response for. They typically return a promise, or you can use this await syntax that we use here on line 10. So we need to specify it as an asynchronous function because the fetching process happens in the background and it can take some time. So that's asynchronous, but we want to make sure we wait for the response to be returned before we continue. So we specify on line 10 here, the const res equals await fetch. So we're using the fetch API that is provided by default for all browsers. Other people use Axios, which is a library you can install. I like to use fetch where I can. Obviously, if there's some benefit of using Axios, then I will install it. But fetch is a very simple way of just making a HTTP GET request to an endpoint. So we call the fetch function here, which is, as I said, comes by default in JavaScript. You can use it directly in the browser without React if you want. And we pass in only one argument, which is the string here, which is the URL to our backend API. So in this case, we're specifying the full HTTP localhost. When you have lots of API calls, you might separate this into a configuration value. Since we're only calling one API, I'm just going to hard code it here. Essentially, we have the host that our API is running on, which in our case is localhost. And then we have /API/hello world. So that calls the endpoint, and it should match up to our endpoint here in the browser, localhost 8000 API hello world. And then we say await, which says await for the response. So don't make an asynchronous call, just call it, wait for a response, and then put the response in this res variable here, which I call res just short for response. You could obviously call this something else if you like. And then the next step is to pass the data that's returned to a JSON object. So that happens on a separate line here. We do const data equals await res.json, and that calls the res.json function on the response object that comes from fetch, and essentially it will convert the JSON into a native JavaScript object that we can use. So we put that response as data, as a variable called data here, and then on line 12 we call the set response function, which is provided by the useState here. So that's how you update some state in React, which triggers the UI to reload and to show the UI with the representation of that state in the browser. So essentially it forces a refresh kind of behind the scenes, and it will show the updated state in the UI. Okay, so we're extracting the message because that's all we want to show. So if you see the response inside the browser, we have message here. So it's extracting the value of message, which in this case is hello world and the date. So now we'll just go back to the code, and now that we have this function defined here, we can go ahead and use it. So I'm going to find the location where the button is, where it would call the set count here, so on line 27. And what I'm going to do is going to change the on click to, instead of actually calling set count, I'm going to delete the set count and I'm going to call update response, and then open and close brackets to call the function. So then we're going to change the count is to response is, and use the syntax here to show the value of the response state. So that should show the new state. When they click the button, it should call update response, which will make the HTTP request using fetch, and then it will extract the JSON from the fetch, and it will use the set response function to update the state to show it in the browser. So make sure you save that and then head back to the terminal, and assuming you use the Docker Compose with the watch flag to enable the watching of the front end code, you can go ahead and open up the browser, and it should auto refresh your page to show responses. And you can see there's no response because we haven't clicked it yet. If you open up your code editor tool, so you can just right click and click inspect if you're using Chrome. You can do a similar thing on Firefox. You can see here you've got the editor tools. We're just going to click on network because I want to see the request in action. So if I click the response button, you can see it returns the response from the API, and you can see here in the network tab, it shows the actual request being made. So every time we click that, it will refresh and it will make a new request to the backend API, and it will show that in the updated state of the React project. So that's how you add a Django REST Framework backend to an existing React project that uses Docker. We have all of the different services defined using Docker, so you should be able to just get this project up and running by typing Docker Compose up. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe and please like the video. It really helps us grow the channel. And also please check out our courses on our website if you want to go into more detail into some of these topics. And if you have any requests for future content, you have a suggestion for any videos that we make next, then please leave them in the comments below and we'll make them based on the popularity of the comments that we get. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.